My story of the week, civil disobedience as final resort. Last week, we told you a little bit about a 30-year-old man named Tim DeChristopher. He's currently serving a 2-year sentence in federal prison for an act of civil disobedience. In 2008, DeChristopher attended a Bureau of Land Management auction in Salt Lake City for federal energy leases. His original intent was to join a protest outside, but he ended up actually going into the auction, where he grabbed a bidding paddle and bought leases totaling almost $1.8 million. DeChristopher had no intention of paying for the leases when he bid. Rather, he wanted to disrupt the process by which federal land is turned over to fossil fuel companies without consideration for the effects on the climate the burning of that extracted fuel will have. DeChristopher and his allies maintain that it's a rigged, corrupt process to its core, that the auction was a fire sale put together by the Bush administration on their way out the door and without due consideration for the possible adverse environmental effects of drilling on land near several national parks. In fact, Obama's Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, would later cancel all the auction leases that were auctioned that day, saying the decisions to parcel out the land up for lease were, quote, rushed. And this is how DeChristopher, in his own words, explains his actions.
You know, I'm not looking to be a martyr or anything like that. I've seen the need for more serious action by the environmental movement and to protect a livable future for all of us. I've seen that need for a long time, and frankly, I've been hoping that someone would step up and someone would come out and be the leader, and someone would put themselves on the line and make the sacrifices necessary to get us on a path to a more livable future. I guess I just couldn't wait any longer for that someone to come out there and had to accept the fact that that someone might be me.
DeChristopher may not want to be a martyr, but the federal government seems intent on making him one. In 2009, he was indicted for making false and fraudulent statements when he signed up to participate in the auction and for violating the Federal Onshore Oil and Gas Leasing Reform Act. Last year, he was convicted on both of the counts against him and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. Assistant U.S. Attorney John Huber justified his prosecution of DeChristopher by saying he had to deter future activists, adding, "The rule of law is the bedrock of our civilized society, not acts of civil disobedience committed in the name of the cause of the day." Ignore the Fox News-style sneering in that statement, and Huber could have been speaking in any age, channeling the voice of the status quo, of the powers that be, of the establishment, and even the sympathetic but prudent liberals who declare during any particular struggle they turn up their noses at civil disobedience. Tisk ticks those who work in channels of dissent outside of the neatly prescribed ones of petition gathering and door knocking. No one got more consistent skepticism and criticism of this kind than Martin Luther King Jr. Here's one instance from Meet the Press.
But Dr. King, this is a nation that lives under law. Above the Supreme Court is graven equal justice under law. Each of us to decide when it's all right to break a law. We have Congress to change a law. We have the courts to interpret the law. Are you going beyond them?
Of course, in hindsight, once the activists have won and the matter is settled, those who successfully pursue civil disobedience are seen as saints and prophets. But their contemporaries, more often than not, view them as scoundrels, troublemakers, and miscreants, as if they are seizing for themselves some special right, causing conflict where there should be order and comedy. But if there's any one challenge we now face that is screaming out for a mass movement of sustained, direct, nonviolent action and civil disobedience, it is the challenge of climate change. Because we have tried politics as usual, and it has been a colossal failure. Even with the largest Democratic majorities in both houses since LBJ and a Democratic president, Democrats were unable to even get the Senate to vote on a climate bill. Now, those historic margins are gone. And one entire side of the political spectrum, the conservative movement and the Republican Party it controls, has made denial of the basic facts of climate change a badge of pride and tribal symbol of virtue. Any politician who had previously supported policies to reduce carbon emissions and mitigate the possibility of genuine catastrophe has had to publicly recant, like a dissident paraded before a Stalin-era show trial. Even the president has been cowed into endorsing an all-of-the-above energy strategy that includes boosting domestic oil production to the highest level it's been in 8 years. So even though the problem requires a federal solution, no federal solution is possible in anything resembling the near term. And yet, the clock ticks. The Earth's atmosphere does not care about the filibuster. Its patterns are changing before our eyes as our system dithers. Last month alone, U.S. cities recorded more than 6,000 record-high days. The only hope, and I say this without hyperbole, is to force the issue forward through channels other than electoral politics. In fact, one of the biggest victories the climate movement has had over the past several years is managing to stop authorization of the Keystone Pipeline. When activists first started mobilizing against the pipeline, almost everyone in the know figured its approval and construction were a done deal. But when activists showed up in D.C. last summer to get arrested by the hundreds outside the White House, they pushed the issue into the news, highlighted the negative environmental impacts, and somewhat miraculously helped turn the pipeline into a political football. It is now on hold, though the Obama administration has promised to expedite construction of its lower half. Every day that it is delayed, however, is a day that more of the carbon in the Alberta tar sands stays in the ground. And that's really what this is about, finding ways to disrupt our normal system of the extraction and burning of fuel, because it is that very normalcy that is endangering our lives. At his sentencing hearing, DeChristopher gave a remarkable, impassioned 35-minute statement to the court about why he did what he did. It's a stirring document, and this part has stayed with me. Given the destruction of our democratic institutions that once gave citizens access to power, my future will likely involve civil disobedience. Nothing that happens here today will change that. I don't mean that in any sort of disrespectful way at all, but you don't have that authority. You have authority over my life, but not my principles. Those are mine alone. I have no desire to go to prison, and any assertion that I want to be even a temporary martyr is false. I want you to join me in standing up for the right and responsibility of citizens to challenge their government. I want you to join me in valuing this country's rich history of nonviolent civil disobedience. This is not going away. At this point of unimaginable threats on the horizon, this is what hope looks like. In these times of a morally bankrupt government that has sold out its principles, this is what patriotism looks like. With countless lives on the line, this is what love looks like, and it will only grow. The choice you are making today is, what side are you on? I want our guests to weigh in on this, and I want to speak with Tim DeChristopher's lawyer coming up. Joining me now is Patrick Shea, attorney for Tim DeChristopher and former director of the Bureau of Land Management. Patrick, thanks for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about how this case proceeded and why you think the government pursued it as vigorously as they did? I mean, a few of the facts seem incredibly mitigating. The fact that after the auction, DeChristopher was able to raise enough money to make the first down payment on the leases that he purchased. The Bureau of Land Management said they didn't want them. The fact that other people in the past have been unable to pay for leases that they bought at auction. What do you think was driving the government's vigorous prosecution here?
Well, I think you have to think of three different levels. The first is the people who ran the operation at the Bureau of Land Management were embarrassed by a very smart young college student who, he didn't grab a bidding thing, he was offered. The BLM employee said to him, "Are you a bidder?" And he said, "Well, yes, I am." And he signed the form, which was the document they used to prosecute him. So at that level, there were bureaucrats who were embarrassed by their action. But at a more important level, it goes to your earlier quoting of his statement at the sentencing hearing. The people in the administration who were feeding the fossil fuel supporters were the ones who finally had their political shenanigans revealed, that this auction was illegal and the proceedings had not been properly laid down. And just as one example, when I was director of BLM, if you were going to come in and bid, you had to have a letter of credit, or you had to have some way of showing that you could actually pay for it. In the heyday of the Bush administration, anybody, for instance, Tim DeChristopher, could walk off the street and participate. And the BLM actually had a name for them. They called them bid walkers. There were 29 other individuals who showed up at these auctions who bid and then failed to pay but were never prosecuted. And then the third level was the fossil fuel industry. This had been a very sweet, rigged field. In fact, in 2003 and 2004, William Koch of the Koch brothers had entered into a secret memorandum agreement with another energy company to fix the bidding. And when that was finally revealed, because one of Koch's executives became a federal whistleblower,
wow.
They had to pay $275,000 fine, but they got to keep their illegitimate bids, and nobody was penalized. Nobody served any time in prison, and yet a young college student who is incredibly intelligent with a great deal of integrity and love for this country is sitting in a prison in Hairlong, California, and up until last week was in isolation because he had supposedly threatened somebody by giving back a donation to a donor whose policies he disagreed with.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that, and we can talk with the panel a little bit about the dynamics of civil disobedience and climate change right after we take this break. We have Patrick Shea joining us remotely. He's the lawyer for Tim DeChristopher, who's a climate activist who is doing a 2-year sentence in federal prison. Will you just briefly explain, Patrick? We talked on this story last week, and when I have to tell you, we were writing it up for the Now We Know segment of our program, and when I looked in the details, I sent an email to staff saying that this doesn't seem possible because the facts are so bizarre that he was taken from the general population and put into quasi-isolation. I think he had one other cellmate because of an email he sent to reporters basically saying there's someone who's donating to us who wants to oversee outsource jobs, and we should give his donation back. And a member of Congress, an unnamed member of Congress, was able to get him moved out of the general population. Is that right?
Well, again, I think you have to have read Kafka's The Trial, where you'll recall that the victim didn't know why he was there, who his judge was, who his executioner was. And in Tim's case, he had sent an email, and the Bureau of Prisons has an algorithm that reads all the emails, and if certain words or phrases are used, then that's evaluated. And when I was director of the Bureau of Land Management, if I wanted to initiate something but I didn't want it coming from myself, I would have one of the staff call one of our former staff people who worked on the Hill, either for a congressperson or the committee, and say, if you ask Director Shea this question, then we'd be able to do something. And sure enough, that would happen. So there was this sort of kabuki theater, is what Secretary Babbitt called, and I think that's what happened here. And then that gave them the right to isolate Tim, as happens in prisons. I've represented prisoners for more than 30 years, and sometimes when there are gang problems or there's illicit material coming into prison, they do have to isolate the prisoner to investigate the source of that. But in Tim's case, it was purely, in my judgment, a political motive to intimidate him and to silence his voice. And I think the statement you read from his sentencing hearing clearly indicates how articulate he is, both about climate change and about civil disobedience. And he truly, in my eyes, is a champion for the future. I call them the champions of progress, or a COP. And the enemies of progress, as you've seen by how he's been treated, are very threatened by the intelligence and the integrity that somebody like Tim DeChristopher has.
If it was an act of civil disobedience, though, I mean, isn't part of part of civil disobedience is sort of embracing one's punishment, right? I mean, is going to jail when you break the law? Van Jones is objecting to that. What do you think? I mean,
I think that's right, but the punishment should fit the crime. There have been multiple people who've done this. There's this thing in the Thunderbird example of this back in Washington State a few years ago. Nobody went to jail. Right. No, I mean, come on. You know who should go to jail? Right. The third Koch brother,
but the other thing
who's involved with this whole thing is somebody who this was the whole thing was an illegal sale. Nobody's talking about the fact he was disrupting an illegal sale, and the beneficiary of it was the third Koch brother. If the U.S. attorney wants to enforce law and order, give the kid a fine and put the people who are selling land illegally in jail. Why are they not in jail?
I should note also that this happened. Please, Patrick, go ahead.
Well, no, I think one of the problems I have, and I thoroughly agree, that civil disobedience means you take the punishment as a way of publicizing the illegitimacy and immorality of the law you're objecting to. But Judge Benson, who had been appointed to that court by Senator Hatch, refused to allow us as the legal defense team to mention climate change, to even allow Tim to describe his intent. An intent, or mens rea, is a part of the criminal process that is enshrined in the Fifth Amendment. It's a due process right, and this is what we'll be arguing on May 10th when we argue before the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, that the judge made a fundamental mistake in trying to silence Tim.
Patrick Shea, attorney for Tim DeChristopher, thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate it. More about civil disobedience and climate after this break. Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, here with MSNBC political analyst Joan Walsh, also of Salon.com, Josh Barro of Forbes.com, Good Magazines, and Friedman, and the author of Rebuild the Dream, former Obama Green Jobs advisor Van Jones. I don't use czar advisedly. We just talked about Tim DeChristopher, who is a climate activist who's doing 2 years in prison for bidding on an auction, bidding on what was later deemed an illegal auction of public land. The Occupy movement has rejuvenated, I think, the American traditional civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau inspired Mahatma Gandhi's and Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent resistance movements when he wrote in 1849, "Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded, or shall we transgress them at once? If it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine." Our history is filled with amazing and largely forgotten stories of people fighting injustice with direct action. In 1917, suffragettes went on a hunger strike to protest for the right to vote for women. They were force-fed and beaten in prison. In 1932, 43,000 World War I veterans and their family members occupied Washington, D.C., literally, setting up camps built from materials scavenged from a nearby dump to pressure President Hoover to provide them with immediate payments of their service certificates. In response, Hoover sent an infantry regiment to charge the protesters with tear gas and bayonets. In the 1970s and 1980s, members of the anti-nuclear movement used their bodies to block entry into power plants, broke into factories manufacturing nuclear missiles, and hammered on and poured their own blood on the machinery and weapons parts. Next week, a group called the 99% Spring is aiming to train 100,000 people across the country in nonviolent action, preparing for more protests against economic inequality and political dysfunction. Plans for Shareholder Spring include disrupting the shareholder meetings of Bank of America, Wells Fargo, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and 30 or so other leading multinationals, along with a series of student-led actions against Sallie Mae and other corporations that have profited off the student debt crisis. Van, you're involved in 99% Spring and this training. Do you think there has been it seems to me there's been a real marked movement of energy, resource focus, and a kind of rediscovery of this tradition recently in the last few years. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think it's because of what's happened the past couple of years. I mean, I have a book out now called Rebuild the Dream, where I take this point of view, having been a grassroots outsider, and then a White House insider, and now a grassroots outsider again. You cannot change this country from D.C. down. It's got to be bottom up and top down, and the bottom up has been missing. Until this past fall, you had the young people with 350.org who broke the seal and said, we are going to do civil disobedience against the Obama White House. Everybody goes, oh no, this can't happen, you'll be destroyed. And instead, what happened is they got a big victory on Keystone. They got to fight to keep it. And then that was August, and then September, the young people and struggling folks who launched Occupy Wall Street. And they changed the national conversation overnight from austerity to economic inequality. This stuff works. And now you have, initially there's this big fear. Well, now these young people are doing this stuff, and the liberal left establishment is going to co-opt them. They're going to co-opt them. Right. Turns out they've co-opted us. Right. I've got a list of the top organizations: 350.org, Move On, Greenpeace, AFL-CIO, Code Pink, Global Exchange, Working Families Party, Campaign for America's Future, Color of Change, CWA, Rebuild the Dream, dozens of groups that say, you know what, they were right. This other inside play is wrong, and we're now going to be participating in training 100,000 people to be able to do this all across the country.
Josh, you and I once, I remember there was a night when I was watching a live stream of some Occupy movement camp getting taken down. Yeah. And you were saying, what are we doing now? We're just breaking the law for the point of breaking the law. You and I got into it on Twitter a little bit about civil disobedience. How do you sort of, what's your sense of watching all this unfold?
Well, I think your position here is remarkably extreme. It seems to me like Basically, any time that you decide that a law is wrong, you seem to be justifying the idea that you then get to break it, and furthermore that it's wrong for the government to try to punish you for breaking that law.
No. The punishment, that's not wrong. The thing is, with civil disobedience, you violate the law. That's why we're saying, we're telling you who we're going to be protesting. We're telling you it's going to be nonviolent. Please put us in jail. Don't do extreme stuff because federal sentences, and you're not even putting people in jail who are stealing federal land. But it's not about not accepting responsibility, but it is about saying this system has been improved both by insiders and outsiders. The outsiders need to start speaking up now.
And you and I actually, this is exactly the place we got to on that Twitter exchange, which is I responded and said, I think you're saying something very extreme because by your own sort of justification, saying it sounds like what you're doing is justifying. It's hard to see how you say it's okay for Martin Luther King Jr. to do what he did, right? Because what is the sort of rubric for acceptable civil disobedience that allows that, which again in retrospect looks like heroic and morally enlightened, but at the time was just, as we saw in Meet the Press, was just, well, are you just going to break every law that you don't agree with?
Well, at the time, black Americans were excluded from the political process. They could not use normal channels to get the rights that they deserve. They, in the South, they often effectively couldn't vote, and so I think that civil disobedience was the channel that was available to them because the government was fundamentally denying them their rights. On climate change, activists of carbon regulation have access to the political process. They just keep losing.
Right.
So I don't think that this isn't when you have a position on a policy issue and you lose, that doesn't necessarily mean the system is corrupt. It just means you lost. And so I think the reason there's a lot of hand-wringing about what's happened with carbon regulation over the last few years. I think it's very easy to understand, which is that the bottom fell out of the economy, and that causes the bottom to fall out of any public enthusiasm for new carbon regulations that cause short-term economic costs.
No, but it's stronger than that, right? Because it's not just in the polling. It's in actually the way that it's become this sort of culture war issue that's been leveraged by the right, and the way it's become the kind of litmus test. That's distinct from the bottom falling out of the economy.
I think it's directly related. I think there's always been a significant element on the right that didn't believe in global warming.
It was starting before the bottom was falling out of the economy. And I guess the other thing is, yes, we love the civil rights movement. It was excellent. We endorse everything that it did. But going back beyond, the New Deal was not handed to us. Right. There was agitation, there were strikes, there were wildcat strikes. There comes a time in American history where the channels are not working. I agree we shouldn't break every law, but nobody's talking about breaking every law. There are just points where the system is so blocked and so broken on certain issues.
Define access. Define access.
Right, that's the interesting question.
What access?
Pursue that though, right? Because if that's I think Josh actually that's a decent. That's actually a decent operating procedure to say when you're actually excluded from the political system, then these other methods make sense. But
I mean, perhaps Van can speak to this better than I can, but it's my perception that the individual who cares about the climate and wants government action, or even the collection of individuals, don't really have access to the people who are pulling the levers.
Right.
Yeah, Josh, I think you make a good point. There has to be some moral calculus here. I think the challenge that we have now is that whether you're talking about the environmental crisis, whether you're talking about the people who destroyed our economy on Wall Street, that we do not seem to have the ability, even with Democratic control of the Senate, we don't seem to have the ability to get the system to respond. And it feels like we are in a situation where the corporations they're now citizens, money is speech. We've gone through the looking glass now. Yeah. And there's a concern that we're living under some kind of plutocracy or some kind of corporate democracy, and that the people are going to have to ramp up our voices. And I tell you what, the Tea Party taught us a ton. They didn't do the civil disobedience piece, but they did show that protest, passion can change the conversation and eventually change the political calculation for politicians, and that's what we got to do.
I don't think Democrats have learned this lesson from the Tea Party, and liberals haven't. What the Tea Party did is they had these protests, and then what do they go do? They go out and they organize,
and they primary people.
They target Republicans as much as Democrats, and then they go out and they vote. And then they win elections.
Yep. Right. Well, and you're exactly right. I think this 99% spring piece is the protest piece. You also see other people who are beginning to move in the electoral arena. The problem we had early on was, could you do both? I think we've got to do both. We got to re-elect this president. We got to retake Congress, but we also have to re-energize this grassroots movement.
And let me also
just, do that.
let me say this, if I'm thinking in terms of where my own sort of feelings on this, right? I mean, it's an interesting point to say just because you're losing doesn't mean the system is corrupt. In this case, the system is corrupt and we're losing. But for people that are say who are ardent pro-life activists, right? They feel the system is corrupt. They feel it's rigged against them. And I would say yes, go pursue nonviolent civil disobedience. Go get arrested. You know what I mean? And do I like that? No. Am I going to go cheer them on or give them money? No. But I think that's fully on the table as a mechanism of achieving your policy ends.
Okay, but so let's say that some pro-life activists find some sort of operationally similar way to disrupt the business of Planned Parenthood, just as if lots of people came in and put fake bids in BLM auctions, it would disrupt the BLM auction process. Would it be valid for that activist to then say, well, you shouldn't send me to jail for the fraud I committed? But we're saying
it depends on, again, now we're into a hypothetical that I can't adjudicate because but yes, if they threw the book at this person for 2 years, I mean, I don't think that's a proper sentence. I agree that like part of the main problem here, the funny thing about Thoreau, of course, is that he refused to pay the poll tax. That was his first act of civil disobedience, thrown in jail, and then a family member paid the tax for him and bailed him out, which he was super ticked off about. But side note, I think that you have to embrace the punishment at a certain level, and obviously letter from Birmingham jail and all that tradition comes from that.
That is the distinction. Gandhi, before he would march, he would write a letter and he would send it to the governor. He would say, here are the names and addresses of everyone participating, and we are going to do it on this time at this date, because the point is, we're not ambushing you. We want you to be fully prepared to arrest us, because we feel it is a moral responsibility to break unjust laws and to accept the punishment. But the punishment needs to fit the crime, and that's a concern with this other case.
I want to talk about something that has been lighting up the internet and news this week. Pink slime. We tried to get some. We don't have it.